Good morning, fellow Richmond Rose Society members. We are here at Lynn Papas' house for our February the 28th meeting. She's going to present the history of the Richmond Rose Society. As she shows us of the Richmond Rose Society, how long and strong the society has been. We have gone through a very unusual year. We've had a few meetings that was filmed by Jerry Long and Marie and met at some of our members' houses. I'm hoping to have a meeting of the Society March the 21st at Winter Park Recreational Center, 2 to 4. There is enough room to spare space people 6 feet apart and have everybody feel comfortable at the meeting. I will get Carol Fox to email the address to our members. I thank everyone that has paid their dues for 2021. Please, if you have not, please think of it over and help us keep our long society going. Any questions, call Carl or email me at pdsmith1116@gmail.com or phone 757-645-5684. Now we will present Miss Lynn.
Richmond Rose Society came into existence in 1937. The early members were, for the most part, from Richmond's near West End, and early meetings were held on a weekday morning at the Southern Bank and Trust. Almost all of the early members were women, and they were always referred to as Mrs. John, Mrs. James, Mrs. George, etc. 1948. One of our earliest records is a letter from Mr. E.D. Duval, president of the Tidewater Rose Society, to our president, Mrs. George Rogers, calling for a meeting at our Spring Rose show at Miller and Rhodes to establish the Colonial District. 1950. We published a yearbook. 1957, June 9th through the 16th was proclaimed as National Rose Week, and here you see a letter of proclamation from then Governor Thomas B. Stanley. In 1957 is also the year that we established the Rose Test Garden at Maymont Nature Center, and we have a copy of the letter from our president, Mrs. James Adams, to Mr. C.F. Wilkerson, City Director of Parks, asking the city to establish a rose test garden under the leadership of Mrs. Helen Woolridge. Helen Woolridge ran the test garden from 1957 right through to 1970, and it was in the Italian gardens where the city parks people planted the roses and they watered them, and we maintained and evaluated as many as several hundred roses there, from Jackson and Perkins and also some from Armstrong roses. The city workers planted and watered them, but we deadheaded, we pruned, and we evaluated all the roses. And thanks to Mrs. Woolridge, we have a complete record of every rose ever planted in these test gardens over the period of more than 12 years. At this very same time, Mrs. Woolridge also had a miniature rose test garden at her home at 1405 Westwood Avenue, where she grew several hundred roses, and she also had an orchid house where she had about 1,000 orchids in it. She was quite a busy lady. In 1970, the city renovated the Italian gardens back to the original plantings and moved all of the roses to Bloemendahl House. Many of them did not survive the move, and at the time Armstrong Roses was going out of business, and very shortly thereafter Jackson and Perkins pulled out of the Test Gardens business. Mrs. Woolridge was our 6th, 8th, and 10th, and 20th, president. She was also an officer in the Richmond Council of Garden Clubs. In 1970, Jim Diggs joined the Richmond Rose Society. At that time, meetings were held in the Miller and Rhodes Oak Room at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. The members, who were almost all women, dressed for the occasion too. Men were required to wear a sports jacket, and active membership was necessary. Also, you could not just attend a meeting. You had to be sponsored for membership and grow at least a dozen roses, and someone would come to and visit your rose garden to make sure that you met the qualifications. In Jim's case, that person was Helen Woolridge, whom he described as a force of nature. This was about the same time that Alberta Powell showed up in our records. We have several pictures of garden tours at Alberta's and Jim's gardens where, in the heat of summer, all the ladies are in dresses and hats, and the men are all wearing long pants and short-sleeved shirts. Another person who was very active at this time was Dick Griffith. He gave programs at Bloemendahl House and did all sorts of other rose events, and we had pictures of him presenting awards while wearing a tuxedo or a coral suit. Alberta was another one who always came dressed to the nines. And in fact, I can remember Alberta coming to one of our picnics at Annette Critelli's house dressed in a two-piece suede cloth suit and high heels and a hat. In 1980, Jim Diggs became our president. Jim literally rescued the Richmond Rose Society from going into oblivion by getting the monthly meetings switched to a Sunday afternoon. At the time, we were still meeting on a Wednesday morning for coffee, and by starting to publish a newsletter. In the early days, the newsletter was published monthly and typed on mimeograph sheets, and I think Jim wrote all the articles. Before we helped break ground for the Rose Garden at the Children's Hospital, we ran a pruning workshops at St. Gertrude's School for a number of years, and Guy Iannello was in charge of this. Guy Iannello was a Rose Society member who took over the Rose Test Garden when it was moved to Bloemendahl House. Later on, he also ran the Rose Pruning Workshop that we did at St. Gertrude's, which we did for some years before we went to the Children's Hospital. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan declared the rose our national flower, and the Rose Society celebrated this occasion. Sometime during the 1980s, Annette Critelli arrived. At this time, anyone who came from the south of the James River was still considered a little suspect, and members still dressed up for the occasion. Annette helped change this, and she helped to open up the Rose Society to more people. Annette had no fear of jumping right in. 1989, Lou Long. I simply cannot imagine Lou Long ever being a novice rose grower. When I came in the early 2000s, Lou knew far too much to have ever been a novice. Also, Lou was known for his Hawaiian shirts, not a sports jacket and tie. The rose garden that we prune at the Children's Hospital is actually called the Helen Woolridge Memorial Rose Garden, and it was dedicated in the mid-1980s. Also, during the 1980s, then President Dick Griffith and other members of the Richmond Rose Society were involved with setting up a rose garden at Berkeley Plantation. Kay Savage, pictured here in her and her husband Andy's rose garden here. Andy loved his red hybrid teas, and he was particularly fond of Veterans Honor. Annette Cricelli, pictured here, was known for her innovative floral designs. She also did a lot of other things for the Society, particularly for the Rose Show, where she was in charge of the trophies. She also had all the show floor set up and hospitality for everyone. She was also in charge of hospitality for our monthly meetings for many years and was president for at least one term. Susan Clinton Peel was one of our presidents. She was a Rose Show judge at age 15. Planting a garden of Veterans Honor at the Virginia War Memorial. Willie Mills. Willie was our president for many years during the early 2000s and 2010s. Willie was a very modest man who grew hundreds of roses at his cottage in Ashland and preferred to work kind of behind the scenes. While Annette might be the face of the Rose Society Rose Show, Willie was the one who transported the show setup, and while the rest of us were clerking, he took down the extra supplies, put them all back and away, cleaned up the mess that we'd made out there, and if you needed someone to talk to, he was always willing to listen and help solve problems. Organized our arrangements with strangers. Don was also an important member of the show team and handled all the arrangements with Lewis Ginter Botanical Gardens. He and Sue were responsible for the Fragrant Rose Awards category, which now bears their name. And in conclusion, as Willie would say, there you go,